Beneath the slate-gray skies of early autumn, the quiet suburban neighborhood where Dean and Sarah Carter lived looked idyllic. Their house, a modest but comfortable two-story home with a red door and tidy flower beds, was the kind of place that seemed to promise safety and stability. But as Dean stepped out of his car that fateful evening, there was an unease lingering in the air, a tension he couldn't quite place. Dean, a man of 42 with a build hardened by years in the military, had spent the past year adjusting to civilian life. His days were now consumed with a small security consulting business he'd started after retiring from the Special Forces. It was steady, fulfilling work that allowed him to channel his skills into something constructive, but it hadn't been without its challenges. Sarah had been his rock through it all, or so he thought. They had met in their 20s, when she was a spirited young artist and he was just a soldier with dreams of making a difference. Over the years, her passion for painting had faded, replaced by a corporate job she often complained about but clung to for its stability. Dean chalked it up to life's inevitable compromises, just as he traded battlefield camaraderie for the quiet loneliness of his home office. Still, they'd seemed solid. There were no screaming fights or icy silences, no betrayals that Dean could detect. Or so he thought. That night, as he pulled into the garage, he was preoccupied with mundane thoughts, a client's upcoming security audit, a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, and whether Sarah would be home yet. She'd mentioned a work dinner earlier in the week, but lately, her schedule had grown unpredictable. He parked his truck, killed the engine, and grabbed his briefcase. The garage door began its slow descent behind him, cutting off the outside world. Then he felt it, the unmistakable prickle of being watched. Dean turned sharply, his instincts honed from years in combat kicking in before his mind fully registered the danger. 3 men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by ski masks. They moved with predatory confidence, spreading out to block any chance of escape. One of them carried a crowbar, another a length of chain, and the third held something in his pocket, a weapon, most likely. For a fraction of a second, Dean's mind flickered to Sarah. Was she safe? Was she involved? But there was no time for reflection. The man with the crowbar lunged, and Dean reacted with the precision of a soldier who'd spent his life training for this very moment. The garage erupted into chaos. Dean sidestepped the first attacker, using his momentum to hurl him into the garage wall. The crowbar clattered to the floor. The second man swung the chain in a wide arc, but Dean ducked, delivering a sharp elbow to the attacker's ribs. As the third man drew what turned out to be a knife, Dean swept the crowbar off the ground, disarming him with a single, brutal strike. Within seconds, the 3 men were sprawled on the cold concrete, groaning and clutching their injuries. Dean's heart pounded as he crouched, grabbing the nearest phone that had fallen from one of the attacker's pockets. The screen lit up with a recent message, "Make sure he suffers. I want him to know it was me before the end." The sender's name froze Dean in place. Sarah. His mind reeled. Could it be a coincidence? A sick joke? But the tone, the unmistakable malice, it was hers. He felt the world shift beneath him as if the ground itself had betrayed him. A dark fury settled over him, cold and calculating. Taking a deep breath, he tapped out a reply with the attacker's phone, his fingers steady despite the storm inside him. He was begging for mercy, mentioning your name. Dean tossed the phone aside, his thoughts racing. He tied the attacker's wrists with zip ties he kept in his truck for work emergencies. For a moment, he simply stared at the 3 men, breathing heavily. The betrayal, the rage, it was all too much. But Dean had spent his life mastering the art of control, and he wasn't about to lose it now. When the garage door creaked open minutes later, Sarah's car rolled into the driveway. Dean stepped back into the shadows, watching as she emerged, juggling a handbag and a takeaway bag of food. She entered through the side door with a practiced air of nonchalance, her heels clicking softly on the garage floor. Then she froze. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the 3 men, battered and groaning, the garage in disarray. And then her gaze met Dean's, standing there like an avenging specter. Her scream cut through the stillness of the night, and she crumpled to the floor in a faint. Dean exhaled slowly, the storm inside him quieting as he crouched beside her unconscious form. Whatever came next, he thought, would depend entirely on her answers. Sarah's unconscious form lay sprawled on the garage floor, her breathing shallow but steady. Dean stood over her, a shadow carved from stone. The stillness in the air was deceptive, the kind of calm that comes before a storm breaks wide open. His gaze flickered to the three men he had subdued moments earlier, still groaning as they struggled against the zip ties. He could almost hear the wheels turning in their minds, panic mixing with shame. They had underestimated him, terribly so. And Sarah? His Sarah? She had orchestrated this. The thought coiled in his chest like a viper, venomous and suffocating. Dean reached down and gently slapped Sarah's cheek, his calloused fingers sharp against her soft skin. "Wake up," he said, his voice as cold and controlled as the gunmetal skies outside. "We need to talk." Sarah stirred, her lashes fluttering. When her eyes opened, they landed first on the men, then on Dean. Horror rippled across her face as realization took root. "Dean," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. She scrambled backward, her hands shaking. I can explain." "Can you?" His tone was quiet, almost conversational, but his eyes burned with an intensity that could melt steel. He crouched in front of her, leveling his gaze with hers. "Because I'm struggling to figure out what there is to explain. You sent 3 men into my home to remove me, Sarah. Not just hurt me, remove me." Her breath hitched, and tears welled up in her eyes. "It's not what you think." Dean laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "You're right. It's worse. So start talking. Now." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced at the men tied up on the floor, her expression flickering with fear and guilt. Dean followed her gaze. "Don't worry about them. They're not going anywhere. This is between you and me." Finally, she spoke, her words tumbling out in a chaotic rush. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, okay? I was scared. And angry. You've changed, Dean. Ever since you came back, it's like you're not the same man. You're distant, cold. I didn't know how to reach you." "Reach me?" Dean's voice rose, anger slicing through his control. "So you hired hitmen? They weren't supposed to remove you," she cried, her tears flowing freely now. "Just scare you. Teach you a lesson." Dean's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "And what lesson was that supposed to be, Sarah? To remind me that my wife is a stranger?" She flinched at the venom in his words but pressed on. "I wanted you to know what it feels like to be helpless. To feel powerless. You don't talk to me anymore, Dean. You shut me out. And then there's the money." Her voice cracked on the last word, her vulnerability seeping through the cracks in her defiance. Dean frowned, the weight of her words pulling at him. "Money?" "Yes," she snapped, anger flashing in her eyes. "The bank accounts. The secret withdrawals. I thought," she stopped herself, biting her lip. "I thought you were hiding something. Someone." Dean shook his head in disbelief. "You thought I was cheating on you, so your solution was to stage an ambush?" "Sarah, that's..." He stopped short, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind. "Wait. Who put that idea in your head? Who helped you with this?" Her silence was answer enough. Dean leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It wasn't just you, was it? Someone else is involved. Someone who convinced you that this was the answer." Sarah's face crumpled, her tears soaking her cheeks. I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand. I was just so angry, Dean. And when Jake offered to help. The name hit him like a sledgehammer. Jake. His old friend. His best man at their wedding. The man he'd trusted with everything. Dean stood abruptly, his fists trembling with barely contained rage. "Jake," he repeated, the name leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He turned to the nearest of the restrained attackers, his boots thudding against the concrete as he loomed over the man. "You work for him?" The man glared up at Dean, his lips split and swollen. "I'm not saying a word," he muttered. Dean crouched down, his face inches from the man's. "You don't need to. I already know everything I need to know." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through the messages he had forwarded to himself from the attacker's phone, the texts between Sarah and Jake, each one a dagger to the heart. Sarah's sobs grew louder as Dean read the messages aloud, his voice cold and detached. Make sure he suffers. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Was that your idea or his? Sarah didn't answer, her face buried in her hands. Dean turned back to the attacker. Let me tell you how this is going to go. You're going to tell me where Jake is, or you're going to wish you had. The man's defiance faltered, his bravado cracking under Dean's unrelenting gaze. He's at the office. Downtown. 9th floor. Dean nodded, standing to his full height. He glanced at Sarah, his voice cutting through her sobs like a knife. Stay here. Don't move. When I get back, we're finishing this. Without waiting for her response, he strode out of the garage, his mind locked on one thought, Jake. As the night swallowed him whole, Dean's calm exterior belied the storm brewing within. Betrayal, anger, and a desperate need for answers propelled him forward. But one question lingered, clawing at the edges of his mind: how long had she been planning this? The city's skyline loomed in the distance as Dean navigated the streets with mechanical precision, his truck slicing through the stillness of the night. The rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt did nothing to calm the tempest raging inside him. Jake. The name burned in his mind like a brand, each syllable searing with betrayal. Jake Reynolds had been more than a friend, he'd been a brother. They had shared war stories over beers, celebrated each other's victories, and leaned on each other during life's darkest moments. Jake had stood by Dean's side on his wedding day, toasting to the happy couple with a grin that seemed genuine. To discover that he was the architect of this nightmare was a betrayal so deep, it felt like a knife twisting in his back. Dean parked across from the sleek office building, its glass facade reflecting the city lights. 9th floor, the man had said. He stepped out of the truck, adjusting the jacket that concealed his holstered pistol. His mind wasn't on the weapon, it was on the mission. Dean wasn't here for blood. Not yet. He needed answers. The lobby was eerily quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights. Dean's boots echoed against the polished marble floors as he approached the elevator. A lone security guard looked up from his desk, his expression neutral but watchful. Late night? The guard asked. Dean nodded. Picking up something I left behind. The guard shrugged and returned to his magazine, uninterested. The elevator doors slid open, and Dean stepped inside, punching the button for the 9th floor. The ascent was smooth, the soft ding announcing his arrival. The office was dark, save for a faint glow emanating from the far end of the hall. Dean moved silently, his years of training turning each step into a ghostly whisper. He approached the light and peered inside. Jake was there, seated at a wide mahogany desk, his feet propped up on the surface. He was on the phone, laughing softly, his voice carrying an air of confidence that grated on Dean's nerves. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat beside him, the amber liquid catching the light. Dean didn't knock. He pushed the door open, stepping into the room with deliberate calm. Jake looked up, his laughter dying mid-sentence. His expression shifted from surprise to unease as he registered Dean's presence. "I'll call you back," Jake muttered into the phone before setting it down. He swung his legs off the desk, sitting upright. "Dean. Didn't expect to see you here." Dean closed the door behind him, his gaze locked on Jake. "Funny. I didn't expect to find out you've been plotting to kill me." Jake's face froze for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "Kill you? Come on, man. That's a bit dramatic." Dean took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. 3 men ambushed me in my garage tonight. They weren't amateurs. And they weren't there by accident. I've got the messages, Jake. Between you and Sarah. So, I'll ask once, why? Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair as if he were negotiating a business deal. "Dean, you've got this all wrong. I didn't plan anything. Sarah's been, well, let's just say she's been emotional lately. She came to me, said she needed help. I gave her advice, nothing more." "Advice?" Dean's tone dripped with disbelief. "You call sending hired thugs to my house advice?" "I didn't send anyone," Jake insisted, his voice rising defensively. I told her to scare you, to get you to open your eyes. That's it. If things went further than that, it wasn't my doing. Dean took another step, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. He loomed over Jake, his eyes narrowing. And what about the lies you fed her? Telling her I was hiding money, that I might be cheating. You've been poisoning her mind for months, haven't you? Jake's composure faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he scrambled for words. Look, she came to me, Dean. She said you were distant, that you weren't the same guy she married. I was trying to help. Help? Dean's voice turned sharp, his fists clenching. You don't help a struggling marriage by planting seeds of doubt. You destroy it. So, I'll ask again, why? Jake hesitated, his gaze darting toward the desk drawer. Dean noticed the movement and followed it, his instincts flaring. Don't, Dean warned, his voice like a whip crack. You reach for anything, and this ends right here. Jake raised his hands, palms outward. All right. No need to get all Rambo on me. Dean's patience was running thin. He grabbed Jake by the collar, hauling him out of the chair. I'm done with your games. If you wanted my life, you could have just taken it. But you went after my wife. You made her believe things that weren't true. Why? Jake's bravado crumbled, fear flickering in his eyes. Because you always had everything, he burst out, his voice shaking. The perfect career, the perfect marriage. Even when you left the military, you landed on your feet. And me? I've been stuck in the same damn rut for years. I wanted to level the playing field. Dean's grip tightened, his anger boiling over. So you thought you'd destroy my life because yours didn't measure up? That's pathetic. Jake didn't respond, his head hanging in shame. Dean shoved him back into the chair, disgusted. He turned away, pacing the room as he tried to rein in his emotions. You don't get it, do you? Jake said, his voice quieter now. Sarah's been miserable for years, Dean. She came to me because you weren't there for her. You might be a hero to the world, but at home? You're just a shadow. The word struck a nerve, but Dean didn't let it show. He turned to Jake, his voice icy. You don't know a damn thing about what it means to love someone. But you're about to learn what it means to lose. Dean walked to the desk and picked up Jake's phone. I'm going to take this, he said. It'll tell me everything I need to know about what you've done. Jake didn't argue, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Dean stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and left the office. The elevator ride down felt heavier this time. Dean's chest ached, his mind spinning with questions he didn't want to ask. He had confronted the man who had betrayed him, but the fallout was far from over. Sarah was still waiting, and her part in this nightmare remained unresolved. As Dean stepped out into the cool night air, he knew one thing for certain, this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about rebuilding, or walking away from, the life he thought he knew. The tires of Dean's truck crunched over the gravel driveway as he returned home. The house loomed in the darkness, its once welcoming silhouette now shrouded in shadows of suspicion. The glow of the garage light spilled into the yard, illuminating Sarah's car still parked inside. She hadn't run. Yet. Dean parked and sat in the cab for a moment, staring at the phone he had taken from Jake. His thumb hovered over the screen. He'd seen enough to know it contained messages and calls between Jake and Sarah, threads connecting their betrayal. But what he hadn't yet uncovered were the reasons, the details that might explain how his wife, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, had gone so far. When he finally stepped out of the truck, he felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. His boots thudded against the pavement as he walked into the garage. Sarah was no longer on the floor but sat on the steps leading into the house, her knees pulled to her chest and her face blotchy from crying. She looked up as he approached, her eyes swollen but defiant. Did you find him? She asked, her voice barely audible. Dean stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed. I did. Sarah flinched but said nothing. You want to know what he told me? Dean asked, his tone measured but cold. Does it matter? She shot back, her voice trembling. You've already made up your mind about me. Dean's jaw tightened. You hired 3 men to ambush me in my own home, Sarah. You teamed up with Jake, of all people, to make me suffer. So, yeah, I'd say my mind's pretty made up. What I want to know now is why. Why him? Why this? Sarah stared at him, her lips trembling as though she were searching for the right words. Because I didn't know what else to do, she said at last. You came back from the military a different person, Dean. You shut me out. I was lonely, and Jake. Jake fed you lies, Dean interrupted. He told you I was cheating, that I was hiding money. None of it was true. And instead of asking me, you went to him. Sarah's gaze fell to her hands, twisting together in her lap. He was there for me in a way you weren't. He listened. He cared. Dean felt the knife twist deeper. And what did that care cost? Did you even stop to think about what you were doing to us? To yourself? Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing. What about what you were doing to me, Dean? You shut me out. Do you know what it feels like to live with someone who looks right through you? To feel like a stranger in your own marriage? Dean stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. They carried a sting of truth, but they couldn't justify what she had done. So your solution was to destroy me? He asked, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Sarah whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jake said it would just be a wake-up call. I didn't know about the men he hired. I swear. Dean's patience was wearing thin. Wake-up call or not, you were complicit, Sarah. And you need to own that. She broke into sobs, burying her face in her hands. For a brief moment, Dean felt a flicker of the old urge to comfort her, to hold her and tell her they'd get through it. But then the image of those three attackers flashed through his mind, and the softness hardened into resolve. Jake said you came to him first, Dean continued, his tone unrelenting. He admitted to manipulating you, but you let him. Why? Sarah looked up, her face streaked with tears. Because I was angry, Dean. At you, at us. I thought if I could get you to feel what I was feeling, you'd finally understand. Dean shook his head slowly, his disappointment cutting deeper than his anger. And now? Do you understand what you've done? She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, Dean pulled Jake's phone from his pocket and tossed it onto the floor in front of her. You've got a lot to explain, he said. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the phone. What is this? Everything, Dean said simply. Your messages, your calls, every word you and Jake exchanged about this. Go ahead, read it. Relive the betrayal you both built together. She picked up the phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the messages. Her face paled as she read them, her breathing ragged. Dean, Don't, he interrupted. I don't want your excuses. I want your honesty. What were you hoping to accomplish? Did you think I'd just roll over and take it? Did you think I wouldn't fight back? I didn't think it would go this far, Sarah repeated, her voice barely a whisper. That's not good enough, Dean snapped, his anger flaring again. You didn't just cross a line, Sarah. You destroyed it. And for what? Because I wasn't perfect. Because I didn't pour my heart out the way you wanted. Sarah sobbed, clutching the phone to her chest. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Dean stood there, unmoving, the words washing over him without effect. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done, he said quietly. It doesn't change the fact that I can't trust you anymore. Her sobs grew louder, echoing through the garage. Dean turned away, running a hand through his hair. He felt a storm of emotions threatening to consume him, anger, hurt, betrayal. But beneath it all, there was a deep, aching sadness for the life they had once shared and the wreckage it had become. Finally, he turned back to her. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice firm. I'm not calling the police. Not yet. But you're going to tell me everything, every detail, every conversation, every plan you made with Jake. And when you're done, I'll decide what happens next. Sarah nodded through her tears, her shoulders shaking. Dean's face remained a mask of control, but inside, he felt the fracture widening. This wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal, it was about what came next. And he wasn't sure if their marriage, or his heart, could survive it. The night stretched on as Sarah sat across from Dean in the dim light of their living room, the silence between them taut and suffocating. Her tear-streaked face was pale, and her hands clutched a mug of untouched tea that Dean had set in front of her. He leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I've told you everything," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Not everything," Dean replied coldly. "You're holding something back. I can see it in your eyes." She shook her head, more tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't know what else you want from me, Dean." "I want the truth," he said, his voice firm but devoid of the rage that had burned earlier. "All of it. If you think I'm walking away without knowing the whole story, you don't know me at all." Sarah looked down at the mug in her hands, her grip tightening. Her breath came in shallow gasps, as though summoning the strength to speak would tear her apart. Dean waited, his patience honed through years of combat and interrogation. Finally, she set the mug down and looked up, her eyes brimming with anguish. "There's more," she admitted, her voice a broken whisper. Dean's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, giving her the space to continue. "It started years ago," Sarah began. "When you were deployed. I was lonely. You were gone for so long, Dean. Months turned into years, and the letters and calls weren't enough. I felt like I was married to a ghost." Dean's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay silent. "Jake was there," she continued, her words spilling out faster now. "He was your best friend. He knew what I was going through. He listened when no one else did." Dean's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his tone steady. "Are you saying it started back then?" Sarah nodded, her face crumpling under the weight of her confession. "Yes. We slept together. It only happened a few times, and I ended it before you came home. I thought we could move past it. That I could bury it and move on. But Jake didn't let it go." The room seemed to close in around Dean, the air thick and oppressive. The words struck him like blows, each one cutting deeper than the last. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter now. 2 years, Sarah whispered. "On and off." It wasn't supposed to mean anything, but it felt like a lifeline at the time. Dean pushed off the mantel, his movements sharp and restless as he paced the room. His mind replayed moments from the past, Jake's easy smile at their wedding, his frequent visits while Dean was away, his seemingly innocent concern for Sarah's well-being. All of it was poison. "And after I came back?" Dean asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling. "I tried, Dean. I really did. But Jake," he kept bringing it up. "He said you didn't deserve me, that you were too closed off, too distant. And the more he talked, the more I started to believe him." Dean stopped pacing, turning to face her with a look of pure disbelief. "So this was your solution? You plotted with him to ruin my life?" "No." Sarah cried. "At first, it wasn't like that. I just wanted to push you away, to make you angry enough to leave. But then Jake, he escalated things. The messages, the men, those were his ideas, not mine. I swear." Dean's laugh was bitter, hollow. "But you went along with it, didn't you? You let him manipulate you, use you, all while pretending to be my wife. I didn't know what else to do." Sarah sobbed, her hands covering her face. "I was so scared, Dean. Scared of losing everything, scared of being alone. I thought if you were gone, I could start over." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Dean stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had endured betrayal on the battlefield, the sting of comrades lost and missions gone wrong. But nothing had prepared him for this, a betrayal that cut to the core of who he was and the life he had built. "I loved you," he said softly, his voice laced with pain. "I gave you everything I had, even when there wasn't much left. And this is what I get in return." Sarah's sobs grew louder, but Dean felt no urge to comfort her. The woman sitting before him wasn't the Sarah he had married. She was someone he no longer recognized. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, his voice steady. "We're done." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "Dean, please." "No," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "This isn't something we can fix. You made your choice, Sarah. And now I'm making mine. He turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps heavy with finality. In the bedroom, he grabbed a duffel bag and began packing, just the essentials, the rest could wait. As he zipped the bag shut, he heard Sarah's footsteps behind him. Where will you go? She asked, her voice small. Dean slung the bag over his shoulder and looked at her one last time. Anywhere but here. Without another word, he descended the stairs, leaving Sarah standing alone in the doorway. The night air was cool and crisp as Dean loaded his bag into the truck. He paused for a moment, staring up at the house that had once been his refuge. And then he drove away, the road stretching out before him like a promise of something new. Sarah watched from the window, her tears blurring the taillights as they disappeared into the distance. She knew there was no going back. Neither of them did. Betrayal, heartbreak, and choices that can't be undone. What would you do in Dean's shoes? Share your thoughts below.